called it the Miracle on the Hudson. 15 January 2009, New York City. United Flight 1549 took off from LaGuardia Airport in Queens. The captain was Chesley Sullenberger III, now universally known as Sully, a former fighter pilot with nearly 20,000 hours in the sky, a quarter of them in the Airbus A320 aircraft he was flying. Flying the plane was First Officer Jeff Skiles. Less than 3 minutes after takeoff, they flew through a flock of Canadian geese. Birds were sucked into both engines, causing massive damage and the total loss of thrust. Sully took over the plane. Skiles did exactly the right thing and started working through emergency checklists. Sully got onto the air traffic controllers and called Mayday. They gave him options for the airfields he could land at. He had no engines. Forward momentum was the only thing keeping the plane in the sky. Sully and Skiles were about to die. And they were responsible for 153 other people on that plane. Sully listened to the aircraft. He skipped ahead in the checklists. He made judgments based on thousands of hours of experience. He realised he wasn't going to make it to the runway, and that if he crashed into the city, thousands upon thousands of people might die. Below him, the Hudson River. Flat, calm, flowing fast, but it was their best chance. He called for the passengers to brace, and in the cabin, the 3 flight attendants kept everyone calm. They were in charge, and they followed their procedures, understanding this was the best way to keep everyone alive. Sully flew that powerless, lifeless plane to a safe water landing on the Hudson. All 155 people lived to tell the tale. Sully himself has become a byword for fantastic airmanship. He was given medals, he met presidents, he threw out the first pitch at baseball games. Tom Hanks played him in the movie. Why did those 155 people, and thousands more in the city nearby, stay alive that day? Because Sully didn't just know how to fly a plane. He understood the plane. He knew why it worked and how it worked and what it could do. Anyone could push the buttons and follow the procedures. Not everyone could have made that landing. You see, when there's an emergency, you don't just want someone in the pilot seat who understands the processes. You want someone flying that plane who has a deep understanding, a deep wisdom about what they're doing. For lawyers, jurisprudence is where you get that wisdom. Jurisprudence won't teach you what the law is. Instead, it teaches you why the law is. It gives you that deep understanding. It gives you the keys to legal wisdom. Practice law the way Sully flies a plane. G'day everyone, my name's Anthony Marinac and this is the final video in Module 1 of our Introduction to Law. In this video we're going to look briefly at some of the key schools of jurisprudence. Let's start with a really hard question. What is justice? What does the word mean? You may have seen statues of the Greek god Themis, blindfolded to represent impartiality, holding scales to represent the balance of justice, and carrying a sword to represent the power of the law. But what is this justice? There are a few different ways to look at it, but let's just take two. The first we call substantive justice. This is the idea that good things should happen to good people and bad things should happen to bad people. Things should be fair. Good actions should result in good outcomes and bad actions should result in punishment. Good people should be protected from bad people. This idea isn't really all that profound. I mean, little children seem to instinctively understand it when they cry out, "It's not fair. He got an ice cream and I want one too." The difficulty with substantive justice, of course, is that it's very much a matter of opinion. I mean, let's say a couple has just separated. She stayed in their mutual home, and in that home is an heirloom clock that's been in his family for generations. He asks for it back. She refuses because she's angry at him. Unbeknownst to her, he still has a key to the house. And one day while she's at work, he breaks into the house and steals the clock. She sends the police around and they arrest him for breaking and entering. Where does justice lie? When she says he shouldn't have broken into her house, why should he be allowed to invade what is now her private space? He says it's his clock, and he wouldn't have broken in if she'd just given it to him. Both of them can claim that justice is on their side. Can you see? Justice, in this sense, is really a matter of opinion. Now, there's another type of justice that we call procedural justice. This was mainly advanced by a philosopher named John Rawls. He said, look, let's not focus quite so much on the outcomes. Instead, let's look at the procedure. You see, if you've got a clear criteria for a just or a fair outcome, and a fair procedure to address those criteria, well, that's the best way to make sure decisions are closest to justice. And so we do. We have criteria in the form of laws. One law that says you can't break into someone's home. Another set of laws that tells us how separating couples should resolve disagreements about who gets what. And we have procedures. We have police and criminal courts to deal with people who break into houses. And we have mediators and family law courts to help separating couples divide their stuff. And those rules and procedures say that if your ex has your stuff, you don't break in. You follow the rules. That way you can get your stuff and nobody's house gets broken into. Can you see that often procedural justice is actually more powerful than substantive justice? In a complex world with complex disputes, seeing what constitutes a just outcome can be terribly difficult. Maybe the best thing to do is have a fair process and trust that that will give us a fair outcome. Okay, so justice is difficult and complex. Well, what about rights? Everyone talks about their rights. What are these things, rights? Two key philosophers, John Locke and Ronald Dworkin, tell us that rights are things that a person can assert against the majority. In other words, if something is a right, then nobody, not even the Parliament, can take it away from you. One of the most famous, most tragic rights that we've all heard about is contained in the United States Second Amendment. This is the right to bear arms, the right to guns. Now, while that right is a part of the US Constitution, it doesn't matter how many Columbines or how many Sandy Hooks or how many Pulse nightclubs or how many Mandalay Bay shootings in Las Vegas there are. If the Congress passes legislation which takes away the individual's right to have a gun, well, the individual can challenge that law and have it struck down. Even if the whole Congress voted as one in favour of taking away all the guns, the individuals can still insist on their rights and defeat that law, because a right can be asserted by the individual against the whole of society. So do we have rights in Australia? Well, kind of. We have things that look like rights, feel like rights, but ultimately they're not rights. For instance, we have the right to remain silent if we're arrested for a criminal offence. Now that feels like a right, because if we were arrested and police said we had to talk to them, we could turn around and say no. But it's not quite a right. Under some circumstances, you see, we lose the right to silence. Certain investigative agencies like the Crime and Corruption Commission here in Queensland and certain types of court like the Coroner's Court can compel a person to answer questions. And if the Parliament wanted to, well, the Parliament has all the power it needs to change the law and take away the right to silence. So the right to silence is not really a right at all. In Victoria and the Australian Capital Territory, the parliaments have passed charters of rights, but those rights are in an Act of Parliament. So those rights can be changed, again by an act of Parliament. Tradition and a sense of what is proper leave our rights intact, but truly they're legal customs rather than actual rights. Gosh, this isn't going too well, is it? Justice turns out to be largely a matter of opinion, and our rights, well, they turn out not to be rights at all. If our rights are really a matter of custom and law, then I guess we need to ask, what is a law? Well, the easy answer to this question is to say that if something's written in a piece of legislation or in a decision by a higher court, then it's a law. But that's too easy. We can do better than that. You see, as we go through life, we're actually bound by a whole bunch of different rules. As kids, we get used to the idea that our families have rules. Bedtime is 8:30. Homework before Netflix, that sort of thing. Those rules are binding. We obey or else there's going to be consequences. But they're not really laws, are they? Our schools and our workplaces have laws as well, and they're binding in the same way, but we don't really think of them as laws. And then there are social rules that people tend to obey. Give up your seat on the train for an older person who needs it. Don't pick your nose. Don't hit on your best mate's girl. These are all rules, and there's consequences if we break them, but they're not laws. So, what makes something a law? Well, I would suggest that a rule is a law if the resources of the government will be used to enforce it. If the police will arrest you or charge you for breaking a rule, then the rule is a law. If the courts will enforce a rule, well, then it's a law. If you have to follow a rule in order to obtain a government grant or a licence, well, then it's a law. Actually, that wasn't too hard, was it? But that's the easy question. Now let's ask the hard one. What should the laws be? What should the rules be that bind us all? There are a whole bunch of different ways to answer this question. And in this brief overview video, we're going to look at what I think are the 5 main schools of thought about how laws should be made. Natural law, positivism, Dworkin's integrity of law, feminism, and critical legal scholarship. Ever heard the saying, what goes up must come down? That's one type of natural law, the law of gravity. No need to go to court to enforce that one. But there's another type of natural law. The legal theory of natural law is that there are certain types of behaviours, certain rules of conduct, which are a product, as the philosopher Cicero once said, of right reason combined with nature. In other words, there are a natural set of rules out there floating around in the void, and the job of the Parliament and the courts is to identify and discover those by using human reason, and then to apply them. According to natural law philosophers, laws which are consistent with these natural rules will be good laws, and laws which are not consistent with these natural rules will be bad laws. Now, for those who follow natural law, there will be a very close alignment between morality and the law, because those who follow natural law regard morality as being just another expression of how things ought to be. So there's a natural way that things ought to be, and our morals and our laws ought to fit that. That's the whole idea of natural law. Makes a lot more sense when we look at an example. A philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes made a list of 19 basic laws, which he said were derived from nature. His third law was that people should keep the covenants or promises that they make. For Hobbes, this is a basic law of human nature, and indeed it does seem to be a basic expectation among civilizations all around the world. And we can see it in various places in our own law. I mean, when a person makes a contract, we expect them to carry it through. When a witness swears an oath to tell the truth, we expect them to do so. When a politician standing for election makes a promise, well, we might be pretty dubious, but the only reason we look down on them is that our starting position is that they should keep their promises. Another branch of natural law comes from religion. One of the things that most religions do is make rules to regulate people's conduct. Christians have rules in the Bible, Jewish people have rules in the Torah, Buddhist people have the teachings and laws of the Buddha, Muslim people have the Sharia teachings of the Prophet, Hindu people have the Dharma. For people from each faith tradition, the laws taught by their faith are handed down from their God, or in the case of the Buddhists, handed down from the enlightened Buddha. And so to those following each religion, naturally, it seems proper that human laws should be consistent with those divine laws. Now, natural law still has many supporters, but it also has some problems. The biggest of those is that virtually every natural law position, whether based on nature, morality, or religion, is contestable. People have very different moral positions on almost every issue. And those following religious views are always going to run into the difficulty that people outside their religion, who don't accept the authority of their God or their church, might not support the teachings of their holy books either. Imagine that there's a pile of bricks and two people building houses from those bricks. There aren't enough bricks for two houses. They both want their own house. What would be natural in this situation? Competition or cooperation? If the two people cooperated, well, they could build one house and share it, but they wouldn't get what they wanted. If they competed for the bricks, then one of them would get a house on their own and the other one would get nothing. So there are some very sound arguments to be made in favour of each approach. If they cooperate, they at least get something, but not quite what they want. If they compete, they might get what they want, but they take the risk of getting nothing. There's arguments each way. You see, natural law is helpful enough to explain the easy laws, the ones that everyone agrees on. But when things get contentious, natural law really can't help us at all, because who can say what is natural? Remember a few minutes ago when I said that one way to see the law is to say that whatever's written down in the statute books and the cases is the law? Well, that's the basic idea of positivism. Positivists say, look, parliaments can make whatever laws they like. Parliaments can make moral laws, immoral laws, just laws, unjust laws, forward-thinking laws, short-sighted laws, inclusive laws, discriminatory laws. And as long as they're made by the right authority, well, then they're the law. Simple. For a positivist, there is no relationship between the law and morality. Jeremy Bentham said that the whole idea that laws had to be moral was nonsense upon stilts. Another philosopher, John Austin, said, look, there are the commanders and the commanded, those who hold authority and those who obey authority, the sovereign and the subject. If those with power make rules, then those whose role is to obey should just shut up and obey. The greatest of the positivists, H.L.A. Hart, was a bit more moderate. He said there are two types of rules. First, there are what we call rules of recognition. These are rules about how rules are made. Second, there are the actual laws which bind normal people. Now, as long as those laws are made properly, as long as they're made within the rules of recognition, then they are valid laws. Of course, the problem with positivism is that you might end up with some really harsh laws indeed. I mean, like most thinking people, I love the Essendon Football Club and I hate Collingwood. But I'd still be pretty uncomfortable if the Parliament made a rule that, say, Collingwood supporters were no longer allowed to hold driver's licences. It just wouldn't seem fair. So positivists find themselves in a position where, to follow their philosophy, they may end up having to endorse rules like that, laws like that, that could be seen as fundamentally unfair. So where does that leave us? I mean, where do you go if you don't really think morals and the law should be identical, but you still don't think the law should be written without any consideration of people's values at all? Maybe our next theory has the answer. All right, before we begin, an admission. I personally am a disciple of this theory. I am a disciple of Ronald Dworkin, one of the finest legal minds of the 20th century. So if I seem to be supporting this theory a little bit, that'll be why. Dworkin says, well, of course the law is whatever is written down. Obviously, the Parliament writes laws and judges make further laws through their judgments. So to that extent, the positivists have obviously got it right. At the same time, though, in some ways, the natural law theorists are onto something too. Because if the laws were completely immoral, people wouldn't accept them. People wouldn't obey them. Governments would be thrown out for making them. So surely some sort of moral or principled vision is in there somewhere. Dworkin says that underlying our laws, we can find principles. Those principles are not morals exactly. Rather, they emerge from how our society behaves by common consent, our common values as they evolve over time. So, for instance, we have a general social value that people should be able to speak their minds freely. And so any law that tends to confine free speech comes under attack, because that law seems inconsistent with our underlying principles. What happens, though, if two principles collide? Because that happens all the time. If we continue our example, the freedom of speech example, well, freedom of speech is a social principle that we all value. But the idea that people shouldn't be treated badly just because of their race or their gender or their sexuality or their disability, well, that's an important principle too. And it's an important principle that collides with the free speech principle. See, let's say somebody wanted to tell a gay joke, or they wanted to use an unacceptable and derogatory term like spastic. Well, on the one hand, a defender might say, hey, free speech, they should be allowed to say those things. On the other hand, an opponent might say, whoa, you can't just say stuff like that and expect people to accept being hurt or degraded for your freedoms. So what happens when principles collide? Well, they adjust around each other, and one principle gives up just enough ground to accommodate the other. So in this case, we have the Sex Discrimination Act in the Commonwealth and the Anti-Discrimination Acts in the states, and they prohibit that sort of derogatory speech. So you still have the freedom to say whatever you like. Your free speech is protected, but your free speech stops just short of the point where it harms other people. Can you see how useful this is? When you meet a new law, you can look underneath it to identify the social principles supporting it. Contract law. The principle is, keep your promises. Tort law. The principle is, don't hurt people or their stuff. Corporations law. The principle is, when people organise themselves into groups, they can achieve amazing things. Property law. The principle is that your possessions and your land are yours and your ownership should be protected. Understand the principles and you're well on your way to understanding not just the law, but the reasons for the law. Society changes though. Principles change. What happens then? I mean, for instance, once upon a time, most Australians thought gay people were immoral, and the law reflected that. Gay men were prosecuted for their sexual activities in some states right up until the 1990s. But our social principles changed. People came to understand that homophobia was not okay, and that LGBTI people deserved equality and respect. And so the law began to change, because the law was out of kilter with our social views. Dworkin's theories represent a middle ground. They say, of course, morality and principles matter, but that doesn't mean morality is law. It means instead that our social consensus, the way that we as a society see things, should be reflected in our laws. The field of feminist jurisprudence brings an entirely different perspective to all these theories. A feminist might look at natural law and say, hang on, For many centuries, natural law said that it was moral for women to stay home and obey their husbands and basically be treated like property. For centuries, it was considered unnatural for women to become educated or for them to take on certain professions or jobs. For many centuries, it was considered unnatural for women to have the same rights and the same position as men in our society. Now, that truly is nonsense on stilts. Feminists might look at positivism and say, well, listen here. Our parliament still only contains around 30% women, and those numbers are huge compared to the past. We've only just got our first female Chief Justice of Australia. So it's all very well to say that there are rules of recognition and that we have institutions authorised to make whatever laws they like, but those institutions have always been dominated by men. And they've made laws which, by and large, reflected men's ways of thinking and men's priorities and values. Why should women be invested in that legal system? Feminists would look at Dworkin and say, well, those social principles are all well and good, but they're the principles of a society which is still largely patriarchal, and where women still have to fight like hell for their voices to be heard. So why should women be content with laws that reflect male principles? Or even worse, laws that reflect male principles while pretending that they're actually principles of the whole society. Feminism is not one simple school of thought. It's impossible for me to say to you, here are the core beliefs of feminists about the law, in the same way that I can for natural law or positivism. Feminists sometimes disagree with one another, sometimes quite vehemently. But their central theme, to the extent that there is one, is to hold a critical blowtorch to our laws and our legal system, and to show the hidden assumptions underlying it. A great example comes in the form of what are known as rape shield laws. See, once upon a time, not so long ago, in criminal cases, it was perfectly normal for defence lawyers to cross-examine women who were alleging they had been raped to ask them about their sexual history. The idea was basically to suggest to the jury, look, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she's had a whole lot of sexual partners in the past. She's promiscuous. She's immoral. If she had sex with all these other people, she probably willingly had sex with the defendant. Or she was probably flirting and enticing and asking for it. Can't ask those questions anymore. Feminist legal theorists were in the forefront of the argument that a person's sexual history is irrelevant. And the only reason it was ever considered relevant was due to the underlying values of men who were used to a social and legal system which controlled women's bodies and their sexuality and their dignity. The feminists won that argument. You can't use those sort of questions anymore. During your study of the law, in every subject, take the time to ask, do these laws affect men and women and people of other genders all in the same way? If not, why not? Is there a good reason? Is there no reason? Asking those questions, regardless of your own gender, will make you a better lawyer and a better person. Our final school of thought is perhaps the most complex. It's called critical legal scholarship. And like feminism, it concentrates on critiquing the law. In particular, critical legal scholars concentrate on power. They say that law is an expression of power. Laws are written by and for the benefit of those who are in power. Judges are chosen by those who have power. Those who have power can afford the best lawyers and present the best cases and therefore create precedents that support those who have power. Critical legal scholars would look at natural lawyers and shake their heads. The only rule of nature that counts is that some people have more power and others have less. The powerful can be as immoral as they like and still get away with it. The 45th President of the United States of America comes quickly to mind. Critical legal scholars might look at positivism and say, well, that's only half the story, because those rules of recognition, they're controlled by those holding power. And so the laws which are made to support those in power. Critical legal scholars would look at Dworkin and say, well, those social principles only count if they're supported by those in power. Not all social principles are translated into law, and not all of them are equally supported by strong laws. Social principles are led by the most influential people in society anyway, and those people tend to be the most powerful. You see, to the critical legal scholars, it's the politics that matters, not the law. The law is an expression of our society's power struggles and political contests. Now, I've got to say, I personally don't find critical legal scholarship all that convincing, but it's still useful. As you move through your studies and come across different laws, ask yourself, who wins? Who loses? Does this law reflect the values of those in power? Or does it protect the vulnerable? So now you've had a quick look at those jurisprudential schools. They offer a few different ways to see the law, a few different ways to think about the law and to understand how it works and how it all fits together. Let's finish where we began, with Sully. Because in a strange way, you can see almost all of those schools of jurisprudence reflected in the very short flight of United 1549. Natural law is based on morals, and there was great moral strength in Sully's determination to get all 155 people off that plane. When he landed and evacuated the plane, he was the last to leave. Positivism was present in the safety checklists which Jeff Skiles worked through. Even though Sully skipped some steps, those checklists were instrumental in preparing the plane for a safe landing. Dworkinian principles were present because the fundamental principle that the captain should do whatever it takes to land the plane safely and save those on board gave Sully permission to trust his instincts and land on the water instead of making a futile attempt to reach an airfield. Feminism was personified in the strength of the 3 female cabin crew who kept the passengers safe in the descent and got them off the plane. One of them did so despite herself sustaining a serious leg wound. The only theory that was not present was critical legal scholarship, because Sully kept everyone safe and considered everyone to be important, and the only power he was worried about was the engine power he lost when his plane was hit by birds. I've never met Chesley Sullenberger, but I'm willing to bet he'd make one hell of a good lawyer. So now we come to the end of the first module. In the second module, we abandon history and theory and get stuck into the nitty-gritty. We're going to talk about Parliament and how it makes laws, and most importantly, how to read laws and understand them effectively. These are basic skills that you will need for the rest of your legal career. But we're on our way.